The day my stepmom looked me in the eyes and told the judge I had completely lost my mind was the same day I finally found myself. I know that sounds dramatic, but when you've spent 6 years being told your memories are wrong, your feelings are too much, and your version of the truth doesn't count, you start to wonder. You start to ask yourself, am I the problem? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Claire. I was 24 years old, sitting in a cold, fluorescent-lit courtroom in a gray November, wearing the only blazer I owned. My hands were trembling, my throat was dry, and on the other side of the aisle, in a tailored cream coat and fresh lipstick, sat my stepmom, Diane. She looked unbothered, almost bored, like we were there to discuss a parking fine, not the estate my father had left behind, the house I'd grown up in, the savings account my mother had spent a lifetime building before she passed, the letter my father wrote me 2 weeks before he died. That letter, that's where everything began. My father, his name was Robert, he got sick fast, pancreatic cancer, 3 months between the diagnosis and the funeral. Diane had only been in our lives for 4 years by then, and in those 4 years, she had slowly, methodically rearranged everything. The furniture, the routines, my father's attention, his trust. When he died, I found out she had rearranged the will, too. Dad had always promised the house would come to me. It was my mother's home. She picked out the tiles in the kitchen. She planted the rose bushes along the back fence. It was the last piece of her I had left. And now, according to a document signed just 8 weeks before my father took his last breath, it all belonged to Diane. I contested it. Of course I did. And that's when Diane did something I never expected, something that still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. She didn't argue about the house. She didn't argue about the money. She told everyone I was mentally unstable. She said I had a history of irrational behavior, that I'd been emotionally volatile since my mother died, that my grief had never been properly treated. She submitted a journal she claimed my father had kept, describing incidents where I'd apparently screamed, broken things, made threats. I had never seen that journal before in my life. My lawyer told me not to panic, but panic doesn't really ask permission when the woman who replaced your mother is standing in a courtroom telling a judge you're unwell. The morning of the final hearing, I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I kept thinking, what if she wins? What if nobody believes me? I had no recordings, no witnesses to the quiet ways she'd manipulated things, just my word against hers. I walked in anyway, because the only thing more terrifying than walking into that courtroom was the idea of letting her win. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Diane had been planning this for years. I found this out later, piece by piece, like pulling glass from a wound. But inside that courtroom, I was still operating on blind faith and a folder of documents my lawyer had scrambled to prepare. Diane's attorney was polished, experienced. He painted me as a daughter who had never accepted her father's new marriage, who had acted out, who had made life difficult for a kind and devoted woman who only ever wanted to care for her husband. He said my legal challenge was proof of my instability, that a rational person would have accepted the will and moved forward. I remember looking over at Diane while he talked. She was nodding, gently, like a concerned mother listening to a doctor describe a difficult child. And something about that nod, that soft, practiced, sympathetic nod, made me angrier than anything else that happened that day. Because I knew that nod. I had seen it my whole childhood. Every time I cried about missing my mom, she'd give me that nod. Of course you're sad, sweetheart, but you have to move forward. Every time I brought up something she'd changed in the house, that nod. Your father and I just thought it was time for something fresh. It was a nod that said, you are too emotional to be taken seriously. And the terrifying thing was, it had worked. For years, it had worked on my father, too. I watched him slowly stop asking my opinion on things, stop mentioning my mother, stop defending me when Diane made a passive comment at the dinner table. I watched him fall deeper into her version of our family and further from the one I remembered. The journal she submitted claimed I had once threatened Diane during an argument about my mother's jewelry, that I had been erratic and frightening. My attorney objected. The journal was undated in sections, the handwriting was inconsistent, and a forensic document examiner we hired had flagged irregularities. But Diane's attorney argued it was inadmissible to challenge the document without a full forensic hearing, something that would delay the case for months. I felt the floor shift under me. I whispered to my lawyer, "What do we do?" She squeezed my hand once. Then she stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "we would like to submit a piece of evidence not yet entered into the record." I didn't know what she meant. She hadn't told me. She'd said she had one more thing to check on the night before, but hadn't elaborated. Diane's attorney frowned. The judge looked up, and my lawyer slid a document across the clerk's desk. That's when the judge removed his glasses. He held the paper close. Then he looked up slowly, and for the first time all morning, the entire room went quiet in a different way. Not the tense, anxious quiet from before, but the kind of quiet that arrives when something has shifted and everyone can feel it, but nobody yet knows why. What my lawyer had submitted was a letter. Not just any letter. It was a letter from my father's private doctor, a letter that had been locked inside a filing cabinet at his medical practice, addressed to his estate attorney, written 6 weeks before my father died. In the letter, my father stated clearly, in his own words, in his own handwriting, that he had been feeling pressured to revise his will, that he had concerns about the changes being made to documents while he was ill, that he had intended to schedule a meeting with a second attorney but had become too weak to follow through. He named Diane. He wrote that he was afraid of conflict, that he didn't want his final weeks to be full of fighting, but he wanted it on record, for Claire, for me. The doctor had followed the instructions in the letter, to hold it unless the will was legally contested. My contesting the will had unlocked the only thing my father could give me from the grave, his voice. I don't have the words for what that felt like. I sat there in that hard wooden chair in that gray little courtroom, and I felt my father standing next to me for the first time in 2 years. Somewhere in his fear and his exhaustion and his illness, he had found a way to protect me, not perfectly, not in the way I'd needed him when he was alive, but in the only way he had left. The judge put his glasses back on. He looked at Diane. She was no longer nodding. The proceedings that followed were almost quiet, clinical. Her attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. Diane's posture, that perfect, poised, I have done nothing wrong posture she had maintained for months, finally broke. Her hands tightened in her lap. Her chin dropped just slightly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a movie moment with gasps and crying. It was simply the moment the truth entered the room and refused to leave. The will was challenged. The estate was frozen pending a full investigation into the document irregularities. 3 months later, the revised will was declared invalid, signed under conditions of undue influence while my father was medically compromised. The house came back to me. My mother's kitchen tiles, her rose bushes, the light in the upstairs hallway she always left on at night so I wouldn't be afraid of the dark. All of it
mine. Diane did not reach out. I didn't expect her to. Some people, when they are finally seen for who they truly are, simply disappear. They don't apologize. They don't explain. They move on to the next situation, the next opportunity, and they carry their version of events with them like armor. But here is what I've learned, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, because I wish someone had told me years ago. Manipulation only works in the silence. Diane had power over my father and over me because we were isolated with her version of reality. The moment outside eyes, a doctor, an attorney, a courtroom were brought in, her version couldn't hold up. If you are in a situation where someone keeps telling you you're too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic, and somehow you are always the problem, please hear me when I say this. That is not a description of you. That is a strategy being used against you. Your memory is not faulty. Your feelings are not too much, and your truth does not need anyone's permission to exist. I walked out of that courthouse in my one good blazer, back into the cold November air, and I cried, not from sadness, but from relief, the kind of relief that only comes after a very long time of being unseen. My father saw me, even at the end, even imperfectly. That was enough. And I hope, wherever you are, whoever put you through something similar, that you find your letter too. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive when we want it, but if we hold on long enough, it always arrives. If this story moved you, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever been through something like this, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. You're not alone.